Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Due to Future. Jumping straight in with me, I have one of my favorite journalists that has ever existed in the world with me today. I have the fantastic Hussein Kesvani. Hussein, hello.
Hi, thank you. That's very flattering.
I mean, it's definitely the truth. I mean, you are so Hussein here is the UK and Europe editor for Mail Magazine, a fantastic publication. I encourage everyone to check them out. An Orwell Prize political book nominated for his fantastic book Follow Me Aki. That will be in the link in the description here if you want to buy it. I would encourage everyone to do so. Um, Hussein, you have over 180 articles on Mail Magazine alone, and I think that today I'd like to talk about your fun, exciting, weird niche of journalism.
Okay, thanks.
When I told my mum that you were coming on, I was like, oh my god, I got Hussein Kasai, I'm a big fan. He was like, oh, what kind of stuff does he write? And I struggled to explain it, so I decided to go with his articles sound like clickbait articles, but they're totally not, and they're all real and very good.
That's a good way of putting it, actually. I've been like struggling to figure out how to explain the stuff that I've ended up doing, and I might just use that from
Please,
now
it's all
on.
yours. And I think one of the best ways I think to go through this, like there's an Animal Crossing article that we can talk about later about Bitcoin and rigging economies, and one of the ones that I particularly enjoyed was basically about what you learn from trying to copyright the image of your feet.
Oh my
Which
god, yeah, okay, all right, yeah.
sounds like a ridiculous, weird YouTube video by Mr. Beast, but turned out to be a politically poignant message about copyright law for personal people in sex work. So, what was the journey of trying to copyright your feet, and mainly, what on earth inspired you to one post feet pics on Twitter of all places,
Yeah.
and then try and copyright them?
So I think the feet pics is a really interesting one because it kind of like explains a lot of the stuff that I really enjoy doing, but also like how a lot of the stuff comes into being. So feet pics have been like an internet culture, or like it kind of like one of those like internet in jokes on Twitter for a long time. Um, you know, I had a lot of friends who, like female friends, who get direct messages from like weird guys all the time who are kind of like, how much for your feet? Like, how much for feet pics? And they'll like, sometimes they'll vary. So sometimes they'll be like, I'll pay more if you show like the sole of your feet rather than the top, or like, can you do it in like certain angles and everything? And it also turns out that there are like lots of people who make at least some money from selling their feet, right? So on YouTube, I was watching a few kind of YouTubers who were like, yeah, I made like $200 just selling pictures of my feet, and it was really weird. But also like I made all this money and I don't really care. And that kind of got me thinking about like the economy of feet pics, because it felt like something that was so ridiculous to say that it would warrant like an investigation that would just kind of yield quite funny results. And I was trying to think about my way into this. My initial idea was like, okay, maybe I should reach out to like some of the people I know who like do OnlyFans and everything. But I felt that there was like there was some kind of ethical issues I had with that, in terms of like, is it my place to kind of be putting people in the front line of this very weird online kind of internet situation for the sake of my clicks? So then I just thought, well, why don't I just do it myself, right? And I thought it'd be really funny just to kind of like see how many people would, how people would respond to my feet. Would they like pay for me? Would they pay for my feet pics and stuff? They eventually didn't, but it also led to this situation where, okay, so here's like the other element too. Um, a friend of mine, another journalist who works at a big media outlet, he was in this weird situation a few months ago where an anonymous person on Twitter browsed through his Instagram photos that were public and took all the pictures where his feet were visible and cropped him out, and then cropped him out so you could just see pictures of his feet. And then this guy uploaded my friend's feet onto his feet worship Instagram account. And it was super weird because my friend was like, I just don't know what to do because this is really creepy. And there's like hundreds of people commenting about like my feet, and I just don't know what to do about it. And then it got me thinking about like copyright, and like if this technically classifies as breaching a particular kind of law, or should it? And then the serious bit of news with that was that, at least in the US, law officials actually like say that you should consider copywriting your nudes. And this was a conversation that happened in the UK as well, when it came to like the conversations around like revenge porn, and how like the law could kind of help protect people. Part of that was like, well, if you can copyright pictures, or if you can copyright material, then maybe that might help in terms of like being able to take it down, or like laying a claim to take it down. So it ended up being this kind of interesting conversation about how platforms deal with like non-conventional forms of harassment, but also like how it dealt with like the kind of more fringe elements of sex work on platforms that tend to be very hostile, have like a zero tolerance policy towards it.
So when you started writing this article, did you? So you sort of said like in the beginning it was kind of funny. It was like obviously could be an interesting like funny article. Was this something that in a lot of your work where you start off with something which is like you hear about a funny concept or something which could be interesting, and then it leads to a politically poignant message such as issues of copyright law and sex work? Or is this much more of it, or do you sort of go into your articles with a sort of plan of, okay, I could see this potentially being where my conclusion could be, or is it very much I've just found out what this massive problem is, I need to try and implement it into a way people can
sometimes it's a mix. Sometimes it's a mix of both. Sometimes I go in with like one intention of just like I just want to explore this like weird thing, and sometimes I'll come out with just that. It'll just be like I don't really have anything kind of like poignant to say about like the nature of the world or the nature of like particular institutions. This is just kind of something that a few people are going through, and I try to kind of tell the human stories around that. In other cases it is like, oh, I found this really unexpected thing, or I found this like institutional flaw, or I found that actually like the law doesn't protect people, so like in this way, so people are trying to like have to create their own infrastructure, and that can have its own challenges and problems. So I try to go in with just the intention of like talking to people and their experiences, and like if I'm able to yield something more interesting as a result, then I'm really happy about it. Like the Feet Pics one I was really happy about because it was like I learned so much about like copyright law and the nuances of that copyright law in something that was like so obvious, but I feel like people felt was so ridiculous that it didn't kind of warrant questions. And often I find that like it's the kind of most ridiculous and weirdest stuff that happen in our world and happen online that like tell us about the types of people that we are and the type of society that we are.
I think one thing I think that stood out to me a lot about the Feet Pics article is that you very rarely write from your own perspective. Like you say, you tend to involve a lot of other people in what you're writing, and you talk to a lot of people, and then that is how you sort of build your articles. And this was one of the few ones where it was sort of almost like a first person narrative in a sense. And I guess what I want to ask is, do you in your writing tend to try and focus on external factors? So when you're trying to tell a story or you're trying to investigate something, do you have a real focus on those people who are not only directly involved but also directly affected, rather than, I guess, here's what I found when doing this? It's much more, here's who's affected by something happening.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not a big fan of like putting myself in my work. I've done a few pieces where I have, and like the writing process of that has been really uncomfortable, and just kind of like very just strange. So I try to kind of like center other people in as much as possible. And I also kind of feel like my job is to kind of try to kind of remove myself from that work as much as I can. So I've always sort of taken that approach like since I started. And I guess it's just like something that I'm now used to as like a default.
Mm-hmm. So how do you get the inspiration for your articles? So, like a lot of them, they seem to be almost like random in their creation, because there's they're very original and creative ideas. Is this something where like you're actively seeking for stuff, or is it you simply walk around or you go on Twitter and you think, oh, that's something that could be that is something that's interesting, and then it just happens to click?
I mean, I keep like a lot of notebooks where I just kind of note down weird stuff that I find or read. And like I spend a lot of time on the internet, and I have like systems in which I track things. So I have like dozens of Twitter lists. I have various like alt accounts where like which are really more designed as like lurking accounts than anything else.
You never know. You could always be interacting with Hussein Kesvani in some way.
That's the thing.
You could be anyone.
Like genuinely, you could be. I mean, I don't really use the alts much except for like to observe stuff. But what I find is that with the alts, like they're able to kind of curate a very different experience. So with kind of like certain kind of right wing subcultures, for example, where I couldn't just like follow the people that I'm tracking. Having like an alt where it sort of like feels unassumed, but you're kind of like the algorithm like also recommends more and more extreme people. So it's kind of like, oh, this is how like this form of radicalization works, how strange, and also just like gaining an insight into like a very different corner of the internet. So I sometimes find stuff from there. I sometimes like find stuff just by like reading really obscure press releases and stuff. I think one bit of advice that like a mentor gave me a long time ago was like to read stuff that felt really mundane, because there's usually like a nugget in there, and you can use that nugget to like build out something interesting. I think that like also there's this degree of desperation as well. So like I'm a staff writer at Mel, and like I have to like generate a lot of ideas very fast. So almost like the frantic need to like find stuff means that like often you kind of push your brain in ways that are sort of abstract, and that can yield quite fun results sometimes.
So how did you manage to find out that this is the sort of niche that you want to go for, and this is the type of writing that you enjoy? I think a lot of people when they first start like writing things and they start studying into journalism, they sort of see themselves as like they see themselves in one. There's two types of journalists. There's your like BBC where you just write facts, and then there's commentator where you just write opinion, and then there's no sort of space for that, something which is like creative or original. How did you sort of find this I guess realm of writing that you enjoy?
Interesting question. I kind of ended up in it by accident / to like to a certain degree of necessity. So when I decided that I wanted to like try become a journalist, I had this dream of like becoming a political commentator. So this was back in 2013, and like I used to read The Guardian like religiously, and this was also when kind of, and I used to read The Independent, like remember The Independent. I used to read that like religiously too. My parents ran a newsagent, so like I kind of like grew up reading newspapers, and it was like my dream to just like write about politics. So I had like a political blog for a long time, and then when I decided to go do journalism, one of the things that one of my tutors told me when I was in college was like, don't even think that you can do political journalism, because like it's one of those areas that's such an elitist field, and it requires like a ton of like inside sources, and you're much better off like working on a local news beat. And she's very cynical, but also she was very right, like in the sense that my kind of training, I did like very classical newspaper training at like a local college after I graduated from university. And I learned about like shoe leather reporting. I learned about like talking to people on the streets, but I also had to, because we had to file stories like every week, I had to kind of force myself to go into very different areas. And also at the same time, this was also like when Twitter was like a relatively new thing. So I spent a lot of time like trying to kind of like figure out the platform and figure out how people were congregating and communicating. I'm kind of like someone who spent a lot of time on the internet as a young person anyway. So to me, like going on obscure forums or going on, finding kind of very weird networks or kind of, subcultures and stuff like that, was something that I was doing for a long time just for fun. So it was more of like an incorporation of those things, and kind of realizing that, there's some interesting stuff here, and there's some interesting kind of like human stories that you can tell. And I think that's like how I ended up in. I mean, I've done like other stuff. I've done like political reporting. I've done like foreign reporting. Obviously, my book is like it's a book on internet culture, but it's also a book that's like really about religion reporting. So I've kind of done lots of different stuff, but it kind of came from this place of like I knew that there were stories there. I knew that there were stories that I could sell as well, right? So like when you're kind of like trying to make a name for yourself and everything, and you're trying to make your name for yourself in like a very serious way, it was almost a way of being like, look, I can get you these stories that no one else can. So yeah, I guess that was like more of like a market demand than anything else.
So you had this I guess like classical newspaper training. Are you ever concerned that in the sort of transition from like traditional political reporting towards things like articles about feet pics, that people who are, I guess, old heads of the industry won't really take you seriously? Are you ever concerned that those people who you say that they would need these sort of connections would look at a catalog of someone who would like to do things that and think, oh, what is this? This is what is this? Ridiculous stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. And I find this is why I find my current situation like the funniest shit in the world, because it was kind of like, so when the Orwell long list happened, and like I remember there was like a reaction from a few people who were just like, who didn't realize I had written a book, and they were like, "What? This like Twitter idiot just got long listed for the Orwell Prize?" And I was like, "Yeah, that's right, bitch." Yeah, no, it's crazy because like I feel like to a degree, those years where I was sort of rejected from mainstream media, when I like interned at like a particular national newspaper for free for like 3 months, and I was like working like various jobs to support that, only to like be told that like the position that they had, like an intern position that they had on staff, went to like a relative of one of like the senior editors or something like that. A very common journalism story. Or like, just the idea. But I've had like when I was like taking myself seriously, so to speak, I had like interviews with like mainstream outlets who sort of felt that like my work wasn't really up to kind of not necessarily standard, but like it didn't really have like the same voice as like they were
fit the mold, I guess.
Yeah, and it was kind of, and I was sort of thinking to myself, like, do I really want to be like doing that? Do I really just want to be like an office guy who's just like gonna really mold towards a particular standard that I already find very problematic? Like, I'd much rather like do stuff on my own, and I'd much rather like do the work that I know that people are interested in. And ultimately, I think to myself that like, for them, it's not an issue. For them, if they kind of think that this is stuff that they wouldn't touch because they don't take it seriously, then fine. But like and maybe this is because I've just grown more cynical, like during my time over here, I kind of think to myself that like, okay, well, a lot of the political reporting that happens here isn't really that kind of serious. A lot of it is very much like, the ways in which you would cover like sports teams and everything. So much of it feels very trivial sometimes. So, if my work isn't serious, then like maybe yours isn't either. But I also think to myself that like, I feel like at this point, and I say this to friends of mine who kind of ask me whether I would ever go back into traditional media, and I would kind of say to myself that like, I've really enjoyed working at a magazine that kind of offers a lot of freedom and takes like quite bizarre internet culture very seriously. And I've also been very privileged to be able to kind of build a platform with my friends, which is the Trash Future podcast and everything. So I wouldn't actually really want to go back. So I haven't really thought about like, what happens if I want to apply for a job at the Financial Times in like a couple of years? If it happens, it happens. If it doesn't, then it's just normal stuff, right?
So do you see that you say like Mel Magazine, they give a lot of freedom, they take sort of internet culture very seriously. Is that one of the main benefits and advantages of having a predominantly sort of online platform, in that they take these sort of cultural slices of life far more seriously than say a Guardian or a BBC? Is that something which will, do you think, in the journalism landscape, lead to these sort of publications really standing out and really growing beyond what people think they would?
Yes and no. I think that like with the Guardian and the BBC, for example, like they have a lot of very talented young people who are very on the ball and who like can cover this stuff just as well as I can. And so the BBC like also have very good like young reporters, so like Sophia Smith-Gaylor and like Rihanna Croxford and stuff. Like they are very, very good reporters who are very good at what they do, and they also like have a really good kind of grab on the like online world as well, to like degree like much more than most people that I kind of grew up with, and even myself. Sometimes I think that, at least like from my perspective, sometimes with like the big institutional publications, because of like the very nature of their institution, and because of like the multiple audiences in which they cultivate, sometimes like they have to kind of hold themselves back a little bit when it comes to reporting really bizarre stuff. Like the amount of stuff that like the BBC have kind of like, or like BBC commissioners just like have not wanted me to do when I was like freelancing, because it was just too much, right? Or it's just like, we can't put this out at like 11 in the morning. This is just too strange. You can't talk about like, you can't talk about guys who you can't talk about guys who are trying to like restore their foreskin on the radio at 11 in the morning. Like that's not something that goes down. Whereas I feel like with like publications like Mel, and even like stuff like if you outline RIP and a few of the other kind of like zany online places, is that they come from a world in which like the people who ran them and the people who like developed them grew up on an internet where there weren't really there weren't a ton of restrictions, and there weren't a ton of like conventions and niceties and stuff like that. And it kind of fostered this type of internet culture which was really creative. It was like creative cynicism, I think, is probably the best way of describing it, and kind of exploring like anxiety and ennui and stuff like that in a way that like was really engaging and fun. And I think we're kind of seeing now with like lots of Substacks and blogs and everything. So I think it's more about the approach than anything else. It's hard to kind of like rebrand yourself as like a quirky renegade institution when you've existed since you've existed for since God knows how long. And people have expectations of you. I don't think that a lot of people have expectations of Mel other than just to be like fun and weird. So that's like a freedom that we get, right? To be like, I don't know if that makes sense.
The brand of Mel is very different to the brand of, say, I don't know, the Spectator or the New Statesman, because inherently one is a fun online alternative and then the other one is an institution of hundreds of years, which is this back when Thatcher was a child.
Right. There's just like more expectations. There's more expectations put on those institutional things, and I think that's why like those institutional things were always like institutional publications and outlets will always prioritize a particular kind of reporting over, or a particular kind of commentary over like anything sort of experimental. Like again with the New Statesman, like Sarah Manavis, who's their digital culture reporter, is an amazing reporter. Like she does such good work and I'm envious of it all the time. But at the same time, I think that if I spoke to like my friends who are very like engaged in politics and stuff, and be like, well, who do you read from the New Statesman? They'll probably say like Stephen Bush, or they'll probably say like George Eaton, like the people who are like real kind of, or the people who are like known for their sort of political writing, but also their proximity to politics. So I think it's more also like the way in which lots of people view digital culture as something that's still very separate from the world, despite like the ample evidence that that's not the case.
So how do you think that, what advice would you give to someone who's trying to find their, I guess, niche in writing, or the sort of find something which they can do which is original and different, whether it be something like Male Magazine's, online original and I guess, as you said, quirky stuff, or something just totally new? What advice would you give someone to have that, so I guess the confidence to try something which hasn't been done before?
I don't really know. Like, this is the thing. It's hard because like I really worked out stuff through trial and error, and I still am. And like I'm still going through my own crises of like, there's so much kind of stuff happening on the internet now, but like I just don't have a track of, or I don't have enough knowledge about. So how am I personally trying stuff that's new? Like, someone who like kind of does weird stuff on feet pics and everything. Like how, am I kind of becoming outdated and stuff? I think that like a big part of it, first and foremost, is just to kind of be like true to the stuff that you're interested in, and also be aware that like, you don't have to do like quirky internet. There's a lot of internet culture reporters who do internet culture stuff. In many ways, I think there's like an oversupply of them. So like in some ways, it's a good thing to just be like, well, what am I genuinely interested in, and what do I care about? What are like the things that I want people to take away from my writing? And can I make that like accessible? I think like my only piece of advice that I give to people is like not to center themselves in their own work, partly because it can be very jarring and it's hard to get that right. But the second thing is also that like it takes away from like the mission of that type of writing, which is to kind of tell other people's stories, and to kind of like remind people that there's such a big world out there with like so many interesting people who have different experiences and different outlooks. So my kind of thing is always, regardless of what you do, whether it's kind of like sports journalism or gaming journalism, or even kind of like council political journalism, like who are the interesting people, like who are the players, because that's the stuff that's interesting. And ultimately, like the thing that hasn't changed from when I started in 2013 to now is that individuals with interesting stories, like that's the thing that hasn't changed.
So is that something that you're generally concerned about in your writing? And because the internet is such a fast-paced world, and it changes every second. Are you ever concerned about feeling like you've been left behind in some sense, or there's some new wave of TikTok meme that simply boggles the mind?
Yeah, all the time. And I think with all the TikTok memes, like boggle the mind. And like I have TikTok on my phone and everything. I have an account and stuff, but like I barely use it, and it scares me that I barely use it, because I see people who are kind of like, oh, have you seen this like new TikTok routine, or have you seen this like you know that like this politician's, you know, kid is on TikTok and everything, and you know, all that stuff. And I'm like, on the one hand, I'm kind of like, no, because I don't really want to be spending my day watching 14-year-olds dance. Like, I think that's a little bit sus, but, you know,
I agree.
Right, it's kind of weird, right? To be like, I'm nearly 30, and you know, I'm watching 14-year-olds like dance.
To write an article.
Yeah, to make content and be called a boomer and everything afterwards. But on the other hand, I do think to myself that like, oh, like the internet has really changed, and you know, people's attitudes and people's opinions have really changed, and like how I'm experiencing the online world is so different to like how people 5 years younger than me are. And am I going to be like out of like a job soon if I don't know this? I speak about this with like my colleagues all the time who are like round about my age, who kind of all have the same anxieties, and a lot of it comes with like, you know, learning a new platform is really hard, but also learning that on top of everything else. It's almost like a new job to like learn this new software, or to learn this new, like how this type of cultural environment works. You know, one person who obviously gets it right, but who has like this crazy working routine that like I'm super scared of sometimes, is like Taylor Lawrence at the New York Times, who is like a friend of mine. And she wrote this piece for the New York Times, I think, about like how I work. And she was like, I think it amounts to like watching like 5 or 6 hours of TikTok a day. And I'm just kind of like, I don't even know if like I want to do that, right? That's insane. Like, she's like such an amazing reporter, and she's on, and you can tell why she's so good, but it's kind of like, do I want to invest all my time into doing this? And like, so there is this part of me that sometimes wonders like, okay, well, where should I be pivoting to next? Or like, now that kind of I'm getting like old, should I be doing like a different beat? Should I be like working on a different type of subject? Should I be trying to go back into politics writing? I don't really know. So I guess like right now it's like very much still experimental, and for me it's just kind of like, well, regardless of what I find on my, you know, on my tracking and everything, just kind of like center people in there. So it's not about the app, it's just about the people who are like making the stuff and where they come from and what their experiences are.
So like one of the benefits of, like you said, not centering yourself in your work, but rather you know, having the people who are involved in whatever you're reporting about being the center is it's far hard to be left behind, because even if you somehow were to feel like you had been left behind, the people who you were talking to and the people who you are centering in your pieces are the forefront of the issue. They're not the ones who are, I guess, in this sense, out of the loop.
Yeah, I mean they don't have the anxieties of like, am I not on TikTok? So like the animal, like I don't know if we talked about Animal Crossing, but anyway, like the Animal Crossing story that I did,
that's coming next,
that we spoke about before this recorded. Everyone I spoke to were like people on Facebook, right? They were people who were on the oldest like modern social media app that at least, and they were just as talk to as like anyone else on any other platform, right? It was still like an interesting story. So like there are people who still use these platforms, and like ultimately I'll go wherever there's people. So to answer your question, like, yeah, like, you know, because ultimately I think that when we talk about internet journalism, I think there's so much focus on platforms, and there's so much focus on like, you know, what's the newest platform, or what's the most, you know, there was this weird thing back in like 2013, 14, when everyone, and I don't know if you like remembered this or anything, or like you knew about this, but like when so many kind of like open source apps were being developed, because like I think it was like the first time that Android had kind of like made a lot of its open source software like free to use. So I remember like there were these distinct articles about like apps that are now defunct, like Yo. Like, I don't know, do you remember what Yo was?
No, I've never heard of Yo.
Oh my god. Okay, so Yo,
I am only 20. I am actually quite young, despite my face.
God. Okay, all right. You were a baby. Okay, right. So Yo was this really weird app where you would just like you would have like your friend network, and you would just send one message to them, and it would just say Yo. That's the only thing, like Yo. And like it got valued initially for like an insane amount of money, and like there were these Guardian journalists I remember who were like, this is going to be like the future of social media, because like you can use Yo for anything. You can use Yo for fun, but you can also use Yo to like check in on someone, and if you're like a domestic abuse victim, then you can send Yo to like someone who's
police.
Like, right. It was like really kind of like, okay, that's a very weird strat, right? But you know, and Yo went defunct really, really fast. So, but I remember at the time,
its last note, Yo.
I remember at the time, like the tech columnist who like I was kind of envious of, because like me and him were like the same age, and like he had this really great Guardian job, and I was just like doing dog's body work at like a TV station where like I was being paid nothing, and being yelled at all the time. And I was just like, oh well, he must be really in the know and everything. And so I think back to that. I'm kind of like, look, this cycle has happened before, and it will continue to happen. So just go back to the main principle, which is ultimately like journalism is sort of it's supposed to be like people led, and it's supposed to be about like someone's experiences going through the world, and like you can, as long as you can find that, then you're all good.
Mm-hmm. So onto the Animal Crossing article.
Yes.
One of the best things I've read ever. I'm probably going to title the video "Rigging the Animal Crossing Economy" with Hussein Kesvani.
Right.
So the article's called "The Fickle Stock Market in Animal Crossing is Driving Real Life Crypto Traders Insane Trying to Outsmart It." Please tell me about this.
Okay, so number one, it wasn't really about as many crypto people as I hoped it would be. But what it was like, obviously everyone while in quarantine has been playing Animal Crossing, and like my timeline, every timeline that I've had has been filled with Animal Crossing memes. Tons and tons of them. And I don't have a Nintendo Switch, at least not now. I think it's like coming pretty soon. But I played like a simulator of like one of the old games, and I spoke to a bunch of my friends who were on Switch, and they kept talking about like the stock market. And I'm a real sucker for like bizarre digital economies. So like a lot of my stories have been about like, here's the weird economy for like, chickens, or here's the weird economy for like used cooking oil and stuff like that. So this was like a very much like a me story. And when I was going through like Facebook pages, just trying to do research on it, I found that there were like a bunch of these like turnip exchanges where people would like share the prices of their turnips, or they would kind of give each other like leads about like, here's where you can go like sell your turnip, like here's where you can go buy like turnips at this price. There were like all these kind of disputes about like, when is the best time to sell. So I think like generally people have an idea that like, you'll get high prices at on this particular day, but like they don't know what particular time. There's disputes about what time you can have, and like whether the game actually rigs or like set ceilings on the sales and everything. And all of that just made me find this really funny, because as we're sort of experiencing a bizarre economic collapse, where even kind of like the kind of fuel that kind of pumps the economy is now so cheap. Right, it's now so cheap that like people are being paid to like store it. It's interesting that like so many people have like turned to this bizarre insular economy that is run by this one like orange boar. There was disputes about whether he was actually an orange boar or not, but like I'm not going to get into that. No. So Daisy May is the boar, isn't it? And then Tom Nook is
Tom Nook is the I think that's what he is. He's got tired eyes. It's a raccoon. He's a raccoon.
He's a tired-eyed raccoon who runs his insular cartel.
Yeah. And there's a debate on whether he is a capitalist dictator or like basically a socialist like heaven.
Well, I mean, I don't think that he's a socialist, but what he offers, he is like he's the epitome of like a landlord, in the sense that like he owns everything, right? And like he will expect payment and stuff, but he's like far more benevolent than like the real life landlords that we're used to. And he'll give you a loan without interest. So it's almost like, oh, this is actually just like a nicer version of capitalism that
he doesn't demand his payment at any point. It's like, you have to do it. It's just something that you can do. So that's your house bigger.
And if you like fail, like this is like a thing with video games, but if you fail, like you restart in a fairly comfortable way, right? Like you have like a pretty comfortable tent when you first move into like the Animal Crossing kingdom, or like the Animal Crossing universe or whatever. And it's kind of like, I feel like it was just so funny to think about this in terms of like, okay, so this video game has created like a more equitable capitalist economy that is less likely to fail than like the real life thing that we're in. And I just like I like the idea of talking to crypto people, because crypto people for so long have kind of said that like, we're waiting for a moment like this where like, fiat currency and federal currency is like failing, and people will kind of like transition to currency that quote unquote can't fail, like Bitcoin. Now we know that's bullshit, but like lots of crypto people like still kind of believe that this is the case, and we're just waiting for a critical mass. So the idea that like there were crypto people who were using crypto strategies, because they're in the game of prediction as well, and they're in the game of like, oh, here is when you sell low, and here is when you like buy high and everything, transplanting that onto the Animal Crossing world, but also realizing that like the Animal Crossing world is like so self-contained, and also like so kind of like the power isn't kind of like democratized. It's very much centralized, like within the game, and by like the kind of rolling developers and stuff. That it doesn't really have a propensity to fail in the same way the real life economy does, which is something that like they can't really comprehend very much either, or like they comprehend, but it's like a very frustrating thing for them. I just found all of that extremely funny. And so I just decided to write about it. I made like a lot of kind of like the Animal Crossing diehards really mad, because they were like, oh no, we have all these algorithms and we have all this open source software, and like, look, here's this extended spreadsheet about like, recording all the lows and highs. And I was like more impressed by it than anything else. I was just like, okay, so you've been spending your downtime like doing these really neat graphs that like, chart turnip prices. Like, kudos to that, right? That's like a lot of work. And I was really, really impressed by it, because I hadn't seen it until after I published the article. So like, I guess the extent to which people took it seriously, or still take it seriously, like it's sort of indicative of like the times that we're in right now. And I just found that all really interesting.
What I loved about it was, I've been playing Animal Crossing. The first thing I did in Animal Crossing was draw a picture of Bulbasaur and put it on my wall. And then I read this article and I was like, oh wow, like people are turning it into, basically trying to make Wall Street in Animal Crossing. Yeah. And I think it's the perfect summation of I guess your brand of journalism, which is a ridiculous sounding article turning into a politically poignant message, which I've actually been pondering on myself for days, basically trying to decide what's better from this. Because for example, the developers of Animal Crossing, they don't see Tom Nook as the villain, like many people say, because they make the points of, oh, you don't have interest on your loan and things like that. He's kind of like a nice guy, I guess. And it spawns so much debate for myself and people I know who have read it as well, thinking, how bad is Tom Nook? Because he's a landlord who's exploiting you. But then you look at the real one and you go, well, he's not exploiting you as much as people actually are, and it almost became like an absurdist performance art piece, right, where by reading about Animal Crossing, I see ridiculous things in the real world.
And I think that's what it is like when it comes to, and I think that's why like Animal Crossing is like a perfect game for this moment, right? Mm-hmm. Because on the one hand, it's like it imagines an alternative, which isn't necessarily like the alternative that's like realistic in the real world, but it's like a type of capitalism that like all the kind of diehard libertarians like imagine would happen when you decentralize the economy, but like wouldn't. Mm-hmm. And then at the same time, like it's also a universe where you're trying to transplant your own moral values, but you also remember like, oh, this is a place where like trees don't ever like get chopped down in real life, and where like farmyard animals like have kind of bizarre levels of like self-consciousness and empathy and stuff like that, right? And everything is like in pastel color. So like you're trying to transplant the morality of like late capitalist like dystopia onto like this actual created utopia that can reset itself at any moment. Which is just, I mean, it's an interesting thought experiment. I guess like now that we all have the time to have this thought experiment, you might as well have it, right?
I think it's even more poignant because I called my island Rapture as a reference to the BioShock games, where it's about a libertarian Ayn Rand style capitalist society crashing.
Yeah,
and I thought that was very funny. And then I read the article and I was like, oh, it's even more appropriate than I originally thought.
Exactly. I haven't ever played BioShock, but like I've like watched a bunch of YouTube tutorials and stuff. So like, yeah, I kind of know what you're saying.
Yeah. Like its whole game is they tried to make a libertarian heaven underwater, and it failed pretty quickly. It's basically
I feel like that's something I should play.
You should.
It sounds fun.
It's a really good game. Another one of your articles which I enjoyed very much was called "During Quarantine, Everyone Will Have a Podcast," and in the blurb it talks about specifically white guys. My question is what's this piece about, and why doesn't it apply to me?
Okay. I don't think it's just like white guys either. I feel like it was just like dudes in general. But I think that like the joke that's made on Twitter sometimes a bit unfairly is about like podcast bros are all white guys who like don't have interesting opinions, but like have to set up a podcast because they want to like tell their guys about it. Which I don't know. I feel like is a very harmless activity, and it's kind of right. And and I feel like there was like a bit of irony to it because like I have a podcast that is like filled with like dudes, and Alice is Alice is an honorary dude. But like we play video games and like we kind of talk about all the stuff, and I guess like the whole association of being like, leftist guys who talk, do all this stuff. Why doesn't it apply to you? I feel like, if did you set up this podcast like when lockdown happened, or has it?
This was set up before lockdown, so we're clear.
Right, so like, yeah, you didn't have the impetus to start it like during lockdown. There were so many people who like
a lot of people,
and especially like in the sports world, right? Who has like just started making their own shows, I guess because they miss sports. And one of the things that I noticed also, because one of my kind of like side jobs to kind of make sure I can pay my rent and stuff is that I produce podcasts for like a couple of small clients. And I had to like get some equipment for my house, not only so we could continue recording shows, but also so I could just continue producing. And a mixer, like a kind of, to kind of like channel all the sounds together and everything. There was like the one that I used, which like usually wasn't abundant because it's like quite an old model, was like there was only one left when I bought mine. And I was looking through Amazon and I was like, oh, like all these kind of microphones are like selling out really fast. And all these, all this kind of like basic stuff is selling out, which must mean that people are just like using this time to set up their own podcasts and everything. So it kind of really just developed from there. I don't know like how many new podcasts have been set up, because like I don't think Apple has like released their like data or anything.
Well, that would be great.
But I guess there's also this thing about, well, everyone's at home and like maybe this is a way of like documenting like this bizarre time that we have. And like, I don't know, I feel like there's nothing really like harmful about it. And like, it's kind of funny. And I just like the idea that like, there are lots of couples who probably have to like cohabit for this long period of time. And I feel sorry for lots of like women who will have to like learn all this bizarre podcast law, or like, have to kind of compete for their boyfriend's attention because they're too busy hanging out with like their dudes. I just find that all incredibly funny. So,
because I think obviously the article was set up as a joke, and I thought it was very funny. And reading it, and it had such a wholesome ending when you basically said like, but this is a tough time. Everyone's in isolation. This is a great way to just like talk and hang out. And I was like, that's really nice.
Right, and I feel like because so many, I feel like I've been doing podcasting for a while, and one thing that like is really useful, and so when we do like live shows and stuff, like you always kind of meet people who kind of say that, oh, it's like just very reassuring to hear you guys, or it's really reassuring to like be a part of this whole thing. And human connection, again, it's like super important, especially at this time. And like if you can kind of afford that to people, then like that's kind of a net good. And something that's like it is funny to kind of think about like how podcasts are mundane, but like ultimately I feel like if you're in the content game more broadly, like most of your stuff is going to be mundane anyway, or it's going to be uninteresting to like most people. That is the nature of putting out content. That's also the nature of the internet. So like, I don't know, are podcasts really a problem, or are they really like a symptom of like a wider kind of cultural malaise?
It's very interesting. Well then, before we have to wrap this up, every journalist I've had on, I've always asked the question, what advice do you have someone trying to get into journalism? I think you obviously have a specific unique experience in you've had a wider range of of experience. You write for a fantastic publication of Mail. What would you say is your number one piece of advice for someone trying to get into this world?
Oh, interesting. I don't know if I have a number one piece of advice, so I'll kind of give a few pieces,
as many as you'd like.
Have a hierarchy. So one thing that is a bit of good advice that doesn't come from me but comes from a mentor of mine is try to be a generalist, i.e. like have knowledge of lots of small knowledges about like lots of different things, subject wise, like politics, religion, culture, sport, but also like think about what's the stuff that really drives you and what do you find really passionate about, because journalism is like a long game, and it's one where like you spend a long time trying to prove yourself and building up contacts and building up trust. So if you're going to do that, do it with like an area that you're genuinely interested in, whether that's like labor rights, whether that's like religious communities, or like local sports teams and stuff like that. Like it'll pay off in the end. The second bit of advice is to not kind of see like the big outlets as kind of like the make or break. When I was doing mine, I started like writing for very small online publications, most of which are defunct, And then I went on to Vice, and I was doing stuff for Vice for a while, and then I kind of got onto like The Guardian and everything. But it took like a lot of years of practice to kind of get to that point. So start small. There's also like a lot of outlets now that like where you can kind of showcase work really easily. So back in my day, we just had Blogspot, but like there's things like Substack and Deezer and everything. Like there's lots of stuff where you can kind of make really interesting work. The final thing that I would say is really important is don't get intimidated by like the like other people's work. I feel like with Twitter and everything, it's really easy to kind of tell yourself that you're not as good as this person, or like you're not doing as interesting work as this person. Number one, because I guarantee you that they have the same level of anxiety, but also that with media, everything is like a long game. And some people like at this moment have like better equipment, or they might have like more experiences and more resources so they can do this stuff. But what that just means is that like you just need more time and more space to kind of find your voice. So don't put too much pressure on yourself to like have to have your shit sorted out straight away. Just like, especially if you're young, like just take time to really experiment, take time to like have fun, because ultimately you have to care about what you're doing. And like the worst thing is to kind of be in this game and like not care about like, and just care about like the numbers or getting it out there, and not about the people whose stories you're telling.
Well then, that is fantastic. Hussein, thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you for having me, man.
This has been great. I said this to Lewis Goodall when he came on. I'm going to say it again. If Mel ever needs an intern, I make a great cup of tea. So that's my line now. Everyone, check out Follow Me Aki. Great book, link in description. Listen to Trash Future podcast. Check out Mel Magazine. All of those things. Follow Hussein on Twitter at H Kesvani. Go through it. Thanks for watching, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.